At first light on the 19th of February 1945, cold mist hung over the black sand north of Iwo Jima, as Japanese officers listened to the last rumble of American naval guns and decided the advance toward Hill 362 had slowed. For days their men had endured bombardment, grenades, and hits from standard Sherman tanks, yet the basalt-lined galleries and concrete embrasures still held, and forward posts reported Marines pinned below the slopes, their 75mm shells breaking on rock instead of biting into the tunnels. Then a new sound rolled in from the seaward flank, a roar that matched neither artillery nor mortars and made officers glance uneasily toward the shoreline. Through narrow firing slits, observers saw a Sherman crawl forward and halt, its turrets swinging toward their line. Instead of the sharp crack of a gun, a long jet of flame burst from a strange tube, a stream of burning fuel that arched across the ravine and struck an embrasure with a vicious hiss. Fire clung and crawled, forcing its way through slits and ventilation shafts, racing along passageways where shrapnel had always died. And within seconds, men deeper in the complex felt heat drive through the rock, tasted chemical smoke, and clawed at the air as oxygen vanished. A position thought invulnerable dissolved into choking fire, and stunned messages from Hill 362 warned that more of these flame-throwing Shermans were advancing, each one a moving furnace that would force Japanese commanders to rethink what fortified meant in the Pacific. By the closing months of 1943, the Pacific Campaign had hardened into a slow, punishing contest in which the very terrain favored the side that waited underground. On Tarawa, Marines learned that coral atolls could be shaped into fortress grids of trenches, pillboxes, and buried machine gun nests that absorbed bombardment with unsettling ease. By the time the fighting moved to Saipan in mid-1944, Japanese engineers had perfected these concepts into elaborate defensive webs, supported by coconut log bunkers, coral revetments, and chambers dug deep into volcanic soil. Rifle fire struck only the outer skin of these positions. Grenades vanished into cracks without clearing the rooms below, and even the high-explosive rounds of Sherman tanks broke harmlessly on reinforced walls that sheltered machine gunners and mortar crews poised to reemerge once dust settled. American assault units learned this lesson at terrible cost, as small islands became multi-layered battlefields, where every yard had to be taken twice, first on the surface, then again beneath it. Japanese commanders, including Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, refined these methods into interlocking strongpoints meant to survive the heaviest naval barrages the United States could deliver. Their doctrine shifted from suicidal beach defense to a calculated strategy of attrition conducted from underground chambers, galleries, and spider holes connected by cramped passageways. For U.S. planners, the implications were immediate, unless they found a way to collapse or incinerate these positions. Quickly, each new landing would become another grinding siege. Reports from earlier campaigns confirmed that infantry flamethrowers could scour out tunnels, but their reach was short and the operators suffered some of the highest casualty rates. In the assault waves, what the Marines needed was a weapon that could push flame forward, with tank armor protecting the crew and allow sustained bursts long enough to overwhelm anything hidden beneath the earth. This worsening deadlock set the stage for the effort to combine armored mobility with the brutal physics of fire, a development that would change the nature of Pacific Island assaults and point directly toward the emergence of a new generation of flamethrower Shermans, the technical turning point in overcoming Japan's island fortresses, arrived with the introduction of the M4A3R3, a purpose-built variant of the standard Sherman, configured around the U.S. Navy's Mark I flame projector. Frontline Marines quickly dubbed the system the Zippo, a name that captured both its ignition reliability and the fierce heat it unleashed. Where an infantry-carried flamethrower reached no farther than 40 yards on a good day, the tank-mounted projector could propel a thickened gasoline mixture more than 130 yards, when pressure, wind, and angle aligned, giving assault units a standoff capability that bunker designers had never anticipated. The Sherman's interior layout was re-engineered to accommodate large fuel cylinders. In place of much of the 75mm ammunition storage, while armored feed lines routed the mixture toward a turret-mounted nozzle that protruded just beyond the glacis. A coaxial .30 caliber machine gun remained in place, preserving the tank's ability to suppress infantry even as it prepared to fire a stream of flame. At the heart of the system lay a powerful pump that pressurized and stabilized the napalm-based fuel before forcing it through the projector. Turret crews practiced timing to 3-second bursts, discovering that short, concentrated streams were often sufficient to roll through bunker doors, down sloped entrances, and deep into natural limestone or volcanic caverns. The projector's firing arc was narrower than a conventional cannon, requiring close coordination between gunner and driver to maintain alignment across uneven terrain. But the destructive and psychological effect of each burst eclipsed its mechanical constraints. Through early and mid-1940, engineers refined the ignition coils, seals, and pressure regulators, steadily improving reliability until small numbers of M4A3R3S reached Marine tank battalions. Later that summer, these engineering breakthroughs created a platform whose mechanical logic, pressure, heat, and sustained delivery was about to be tested in combat for the first time, setting up the moment when Japanese defenders would witness a weapon unlike anything they had prepared for. Dawn on the 17th of June 1944 broke harsh and hot over the southern plain of Saipan as Marines of the 4th Division pushed toward the entrenched defenses, guarding a Sleeto airfield. For days, naval guns had hammered the perimeter, sending tremors through the concreted pillboxes and buried galleries manned by soldiers of the Japanese 43rd Infantry Regiment. Yet when the Marines advanced, they found machine gun apertures still active, voices still echoing from firing cells that seemed carved to survive anything short of an earthquake. The defenders believed they understood American armor. Shermans would shell from distance, advance, and be met by grenades or magnetic mines. Nothing in their training suggested a different threat was approaching. That assumption shattered when one of the supporting Shermans rolled forward and halted beside a cluster of coral boulders. Instead of the sharp report of a 75 mm round, a roaring jet of flame leapt across the open ground, a stream so bright and sustained that observers momentarily thought a fuel dump had detonated. The fire struck a pillbox slit, flattened itself against the concrete, and forced its way inside as if drawn by the darkness. Seconds later, a muffled eruption of heat surged through the ventilation shafts, sending choking smoke back through the galleries. Another burst followed, then another, and each one silenced positions that had resisted bombardment since the landings. Survivors later reported that they felt no collapsing walls, only suffocating heat, searing air, and the sense of oxygen vanishing in an instant. For Marine commanders, the effect was unmistakable. Strong points that normally required hours to reduce were neutralized in minutes, clearing lanes of advance that had previously stalled under interlocking fire. For Japanese staff officers, the shot became the basis of the first written assessments describing an American tank that could kill from angles and distances no infantry flamethrower had ever reached. These early observations would soon circulate through headquarters across the Marianas, setting up the urgent question of how defenders might adapt to a weapon capable of turning subterranean networks into instant furnaces. In the weeks after Saipan, as shattered battalions of the 31st Army regrouped and headquarters staff sifted through fragmentary survivor accounts, a new theme appeared with unnerving consistency. Fire had reached places where no explosive had ever penetrated. Intelligence officers compiled these testimonies into formal reports, noting that the Sherman-mounted flamethrower did far more than scorch surface apertures. Its high-pressure jets hurled burning fuel deep into galleries, drove heat around bends in tunnel walls, and consumed oxygen so quickly that men in unbreached chambers collapsed without ever seeing the enemy. One analysis circulated to Peleliu, and Iwo Jima concluded bluntly that coral, concrete, and volcanic stone materials previously considered nearly impregnable offered little resistance once the projectile stream found even a thumb-wide crack or vent. Warnings flowed through radio traffic that summer, advising garrisons that traditional reinforcement standards were insufficient. Some commanders experimented with improvised solutions, sealing ventilation shafts with wet clay, constructing crude blast doors from salvaged steel, or posting snipers to concentrate fire on the small forward tube of the projector. Yet captured documents later revealed how little confidence they held in these measures. Within private memoranda, officers admitted that the new weapon challenged the core premise of their defensive doctrine, that underground networks, no matter how elaborate, could endure any bombardment long enough to exhaust an invasion force. Reports from outlying positions described troops withdrawing the moment they glimpsed a Sherman, with an altered turret collar or an unexplained pipe jutting from its glacis. Efforts to impose discipline faltered as rumors spread that flame, not high explosives, posed the greatest certainty of death. By late 1944, these intelligence assessments formed part of Japan's broader preparations for the island battles still to come. Yet they offered few tangible counters. The gulf between recognizing the threat and having the industrial means to oppose it exposed a deepening desperation in the defensive hierarchy. From this rising anxiety would emerge the American response, an effort to scale production and logistics so that flame-equipped Shermans could be fielded in strength during the next phase of the Pacific Campaign. That by late 1944, with the flamethrower Sherman's value proven on Saipan and reaffirmed in subsequent fighting, the Marine Corps and the Navy Bureau of Ordnance turned urgently toward mass production. Rather than build new tanks from scratch, planners concentrated on converting existing M4A3 hulls, a decision that allowed faster deployment across the Pacific. At the San Diego depot, one of the principal sites for these conversions crews, removed the standard 75mm ammunition racks and installed cylindrical fuel cells, reinforced pump housings, pressure regulators, and armored feed lines. Technicians spent hours calibrating each vehicle, testing the projector's ignition reliability, pressure stability, and burst duration, knowing that even a minor leak or misted spark could render the system useless or catastrophic under fire. Because the flamethrower mechanisms required constant upkeep, depot teams packed spare valves, hoses, ignition cartridges, and pump components into each outgoing shipment, ensuring that maintenance crews in forward areas could keep the tanks operational without waiting for replacements from the mainland. This new logistical burden spread across the entire naval transport system. Tank battalions now required steady deliveries of thickened fuel mixtures, alongside their ordinary gasoline stocks, plus specialized storage drums, handling gear, and protective equipment for crews. Supply officers scheduled these materials with the same priority as artillery shells and rations, and American shipping capacity bolstered by an enormous merchant fleet moved them thousands of miles across the Pacific. As a result, by the time assault units assembled for Iwo Jima in early 1945, Marine battalions possessed far more flamethrower Shermans than they had on any previous island. This increase allowed commanders to form dedicated assault sections, rather than guarding a handful of rare vehicles. Japan, with shrinking fuel reserves and limited industrial output, had no means to field an equivalent capability, widening a technological gap already strained by attrition. With manufacturing steady and logistics proven, the stage was set for these specialized tanks to become central instruments in the brutal battles that followed, where dense fortifications demanded ever more forceful methods of attack. The fighting on Peleliu in September 1944 marked the moment when flamethrower Shermans evolved from experimental assets into indispensable instruments of assault. The island's Ummerbrogal Ridge, an intricate labyrinth of limestone spires, sinkholes, and galleries, contain some of the most resilient defensive positions encountered in the Central Pacific. Infantry units discovered that grenades and satchel charges only cleared the first chambers of many caves. Deeper recesses remained active, and defenders reemerged as soon as the smoke cleared. Sherman flamethrowers advanced in deliberate bounds across the razor-back terrain, firing short bursts that rolled flame through fissures, cracks, and narrow entrances before demolition teams sealed the positions. Reports from surviving Japanese soldiers indicated that even chambers untouched by direct fire became uninhabitable as heat traveled through stone, driving garrisons into the open where they were exposed to rifle and machine gun fire. Peleliu proved that the weapon did not simply kill, it denied ground and away. No explosive could match This effect grew even more significant on Iwo Jima in February 1945, where a vast 13,000-yard tunnel network wound beneath sulfurous ridges and linked blockhouses, communication rooms, and artillery positions. Marines learned to pair flamethrower Shermans with engineer squads, using the tanks to flush out or collapse galleries at ranges that rendered infantry-carried flamethrowers ineffective. The tanks fired flame into upper vents, side shafts, or rubble-choked entrances, while demolition teams followed with explosives to seal the tunnels. The combination broke defensive nodes that had been designed to survive weeks of siege. By April 1945 on Okinawa, where the Shuri line cut across ridges and ravines fortified with concrete pillared tombs and deeply dug casemates, both Army and Marine units employed flamethrower Shermans as standard breach elements. Positions that had shrugged off shellfire succumbed within seconds once the projectors ignited, accelerating advances that would otherwise have stalled for days. Across Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the pattern never varied. Strongpoints collapsed faster, infantry gained momentum, and defenders conceded that no amount of stone, coral, or reinforced earth could guarantee survival. These battlefield proofs established the consistency of the weapon's effect and opened the door to the deeper question of how such an instrument reshaped not just tactics, but the psychological world of the soldiers who faced it. By early 1945, the appearance of a flamethrower Sherman on the battlefield carried a weight far beyond its steel and fuel. Japanese defenders who had spent months preparing themselves to withstand naval gunfire and aerial bombardment discovered that courage and discipline could not counter a weapon that reached into the earth itself. Captured reports from Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima described soldiers fleeing deep positions at the first mechanical growl of a Sherman's pump system, convinced that once the projector fired there would be no place to hide. The psychological effect began even before the jet of fuel ignited. Men heard the rising whine of pressurized lines through rock corridors, felt vibrations that signaled a tank aligning its nozzle, and sensed a danger that bypassed their strongest fortifications. When the flame finally erupted, darting across open ground or plunging into a cave mouth, it carried the unmistakable message that the fight inside the tunnels was already lost. For American forces, the effect reversed entirely. Infantry who had once advanced with caution toward pillboxes and tunnel mouths found confidence in the presence of a flamethrower Sherman rolling behind them. The knowledge that a 2-second burst could neutralize a position that previously required grenades, charges, and hand-to-hand fighting shifted the emotional calculus of assault. Units moved faster, pressed harder, and coordinated more aggressively because they trusted the tank to dominate the decisive moments of an engagement. This growing morale gap widened through the final campaigns. Japanese doctrine demanded that soldiers die in place, but flame stripped those last stands of any tactical or symbolic value, leaving many defenders disoriented as their strongest redoubts turned instantly lethal. The cumulative emotional strain weakened defensive cohesion and magnified even small American advantages in firepower and logistics. As commanders recognized the morale-shattering potential of these weapons, they wove flamethrower Shermans directly into the structure and pacing of their operations, shaping the rhythm of island assaults in the war's final months. This psychological shift now leads naturally to examining how command decisions evolved around these tanks and how their presence influenced the design and execution of late war offensive plans. The arrival of flamethrower Shermans reshaped American assault doctrine in ways that rippled from platoon-level tactics to theater-wide strategy. Before their introduction, commanders relied on lengthy bombardments and painstaking infantry engineer advances to reduce fortified pockets, often losing the momentum essential to island operations. Once the M4A3R3 entered service, planners reorganized assault forces around specialized teams that paired the flame-equipped Shermans with standard gun tanks, demolition squads, and infantry platoons trained to exploit openings the moment a bunker fell silent. This integration allowed units to bypass hours of close-quarters fighting. A single burst of flame could render a position unusable, clearing routes for riflemen and enabling entire battalions to advance. Without the attritional pauses common earlier in the war, the result was a faster, more fluid battlefield tempo that supported the overarching American aim of reducing casualties, while driving steadily toward the Japanese home islands.
These tactical changes carried strategic weight. On Okinawa, General Mitsuru Ushijima understood that even the most carefully sited tomb defenses and ridge networks would eventually yield once Flamethrowers Shermans reached the front. His plans increasingly relied on inflicting early losses and slowing the American buildup before the tanks could be introduced in strength. Yet the reliability and mobility of the Shermans combined with the logistical system that sustained them undercut these hopes. Strong points designed to hold for days collapsed in minutes, and entire defensive belts lost cohesion when their anchor positions were burned out. The accelerated pace enabled U.S. forces to keep tight operational schedules, maintain pressure across multiple axes, and sustain the broader island-hopping campaign without the delays that had characterized earlier operations. Still, commanders recognized that no single weapon was universal. Terrain, counterfire, and the inherent vulnerabilities of getting a heavy vehicle close enough to fire its projector revealed limitations that would require further refinement. Those shortcomings, and the adaptations they inspired, formed the next step in understanding how this weapon continued to evolve under combat conditions. Even as Flamethrowers Shermans transformed assault tactics, crews and commanders understood that the weapon carried strict operational boundaries. Each M4A3R3 held only a finite supply of thickened fuel, enough for roughly a few dozen short bursts, which forced tank leaders to ration fire carefully and withdraw once the projector's reservoirs ran low. The weapon's firing arc far narrower than a standard 75mm gun required tight coordination between gunner, commander, and driver. A misaligned hull or momentary slip on uneven terrain could leave the projector unable to engage a target that lay only a few degrees off-center. Terrain itself imposed further constraints. Coral ridges, eroded shelves, and loose volcanic ash could trap or stall the tank, preventing it from reaching the angles needed for effective flame delivery. Japanese defenders, recognizing these limits, positioned mines on natural choke points, prepared suicide squads to strike the nozzle assembly at close range, and concentrated rifle fire on the exposed hardware that fed the projector. Maintenance crews worked constantly to keep the system functional. Hoses, valves, and ignition coils wore out quickly under sustained pressure, and many tanks required partial overhauls between assaults. Engineers experimented with improved fuel mixtures to stabilize pressure and extend range, while field commanders adjusted tactics to counter emerging Japanese responses. Scouts were assigned to probe ahead and identify navigable approaches. Infantry squads protected the flanks and rear to prevent enemy infiltrators from reaching the tank, and supporting gun tanks provided covering fire, while the flame-equipped Sherman maneuvered into position. These adaptations reduced vulnerability and allowed the vehicles to operate in environments that grew more complex with each island fight. Acknowledging these constraints shows how innovation on the battlefield required constant refinement, and how the practical realities of fuel supply, terrain, and mechanical fragility shaped the weapon's ultimate employment. These experiences would later inform post-war armored doctrine, helping define the legacy of flame-equipped vehicles as military planners considered how their wartime lessons might carry into future conflicts. In the years that followed the Japanese surrender, military planners on every major staff examined the Pacific campaigns for lessons that might shape future doctrine, and the Flamethrowers Sherman became one of the clearest case studies in rapid battlefield adaptation. Engineers and ordnance officers review thousands of after-action reports, tracing how the combination of armored protection and directed flame had allowed assault forces to break open fortifications that conventional artillery and infantry weapons could not reliably penetrate. Although the wartime M4A3R3 variants were gradually retired, the underlying concept endured. Early Cold War doctrine in the United States and abroad incorporated the principle that armored vehicles could serve as platforms for specialized breaching systems, including improved flame projectors with safer fuel tanks, more stable pressure regulators, and ignition systems designed to function in extreme temperatures. These refinements reflected the hard-earned lessons of island combat, where minor mechanical failures had often determined whether a tunnel complex collapsed or survived. Debate over the ethical use of flamethrowers intensified at the same time. Commanders acknowledged the weapon's unmatched effectiveness against fortified positions, yet diplomats and humanitarian advocates questioned its brutality, leading to restrictions on employment in some theaters. and a gradual shift toward alternative breaching tools that relied on explosive or mechanical force, rather than fire. Nonetheless, the Pacific War demonstrated that in environments dominated by caves, bunkers, and rugged terrain, no other system had matched the psychological and tactical leverage of armored flamethrowers. The Sherman variants thus became enduring examples of how existing platforms could be reconfigured under pressure to meet urgent operational needs. Their legacy lay not only in the hardware itself, but in the mindset they represented: flexibility in engineering, willingness to integrate unconventional weapons into combined arms teams, and recognition that psychological shock could be as decisive as raw firepower. As veterans and historians reflected on these machines, they noted how deeply their presence had shaped battlefield outcomes and the memories carried by those who fought near them, both the Americans who advanced behind their protection and the Japanese defenders who faced their devastating reach. With these long-term lessons in place, the story moves toward its final perspective, where the human experience of flame on the battlefield becomes inseparable from the strategic and technological legacy it left behind. On the morning of the 19th of February 1945, when Japanese officers peered through the narrow firing slits beneath Hill 362 and watched a jet of flame carve its path across the black volcanic sand, they witnessed more than a new weapon. They witnessed the collapse of an assumption that had shaped years of defensive planning. These commanders had trained their men to endure bombardment, to absorb the shock of naval shells, and to fight on even as tanks crawled forward under covering fire. But nothing in their doctrine prepared them for a machine that could reach into the earth itself, rendering their deepest galleries uninhabitable within seconds. The flamethrower Sherman, born of wartime necessity and refined through relentless engineering, carried a destructive language that no bunker wall could mistranslate. Its bursts of fire did not merely burn. They suffocated, destabilized, and broke the psychological spine of garrisons that had once believed they could survive anything. The vehicle's presence on beaches from Saipan to Okinawa reflected more than industrial strength. It embodied a fusion of logistics, innovation, and tactical evolution that allowed U.S. forces to breach positions previously considered invulnerable. Each flame burst signaled a shift in the balance between attacker and defender, accelerating advances and dismantling the belief that underground strongholds could delay the American march toward Japan indefinitely. For the men who survived these encounters, Americans who moved behind the tanks with renewed confidence, and Japanese soldiers who fled from their approach, the memory of those moments lingered long after the battles ended. As the Pacific War entered its final chapters, the shadow cast by the flamethrower Sherman stretched beyond the ridges it had cleared. It became a symbol of how rapidly warfare could change when innovation met opportunity, when the ingenuity of distant factories converged with the hardened experience of frontline troops. Returning to that first moment on Iwo Jima, the stunned silence within those bunker chambers reminds us that wars are not shaped by courage alone. They are shaped by the sudden arrival of tools that rewrite the rules in an instant, closing a chapter defined by fire, endurance, and the unforgiving momentum of victory.